In this lecture, we are going to work on displaying a loading indicator whenever a login request is sent to the server, and once the response is received by the client by our Angular application, we will hide that loading indicator. Currently, if I go to our application, here in the login page, once a user has provided his email and password, and when he clicks on the login button, a login request gets sent to the server, to the Firebase server. But there is no indicator for the user to know about that. So if I click on this login button, you see nothing is happening, and once the user is logged in, the user has been redirected to the home page. So till the time the request is sent to the server and a response is received from the server, between that time we want to show a loading indicator in our application. For that, let's go back to our application, and inside this app component, I am going to create a new component. So for that, let's open VS Code built-in terminal. And here I'm going to run ngGenerate command. We want to generate a component, and I'm going to call this component as loader. And I want to create this component inside this app component because we are going to use the loader component throughout our application. So let's press enter here. And now you will notice that a new folder called loader has been created. And in this loader folder, we have all the files related to loader component. Now we are going to design this loader component. Let's go to loader component.ts file, and from there let's copy the selector of this loader component, and let's open app component, and there at the top I'm going to use the selector of loader component. Okay, if I save the changes and if we go to our application, you will see that here we have this message loader works, and this is coming from the loader component. Now, instead of displaying this paragraph, we want to display a loading indicator. And for that, in order to save some time, I have written some HTML and CSS for designing the loading indicator. So let's copy this HTML. This is a very simple HTML. Let's go to loader component.html and let's paste it there. So in there, you will see that we have two divs. The first div has a class of overlay, and the second div has a class of spinner. We do not have any contents here. Now to design this, I have also written some CSS. So let's go to loader component.css file, and from there, let's copy the CSS. Let's go back to our application and let's open loader component.css file, and there let's paste that CSS. Okay, let's save the changes, and now if we go to our application, and this is how the loading indicator will look like. Now currently this loading indicator will be displayed always, but we don't want that. We want to display this loading indicator whenever a request is sent from our application to the backend server, and we want to hide this loading indicator once the response is received. So for that, what we are going to do is, let's go back to our application. Let me close this CSS file, and for now I'll also close this HTML file and this app component.html file. Let's also close this terminal, and now for the app we have created a store, and in that store we have app state. Currently in there we have only one state, which is the auth state. So this auth state is nothing but it is a constant which is storing a string value called auth, and with that name I want to create a property in this state. So I'm simply using that constant, but what you can also do is you can specify auth like this. So this will also work. So I'll also specify auth here like this, and this should also work. Okay, so I was just creating a property using the constant string which we have created in the constant.ts file. So that will also work, and this approach will also work. So whichever approach you prefer, you can use that. And from here, I'm also going to remove these import statements because we are not using it here. And now let's create a new state. So I'm going to create a new state property, and this state we are creating, this state property we are creating for the entire application. And I'm going to call it as isLoading, and it is going to store a Boolean value. Okay, so let me use this Boolean. Or what I'll do is, instead of creating it like this, inside this app folder, I'm going to create a shared folder. And inside this shared folder, we are going to create all the states which we are going to use application wide. So inside this shared folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it as shared.state.ts. Okay, in here, I'm going to create an initial state. You can name this variable anything, and to create this variable, let's also use const keyword. Okay, and to this, I'm going to assign an object, and this object is going to be our shared state. In there, I'm going to create isLoading property, which is initially going to be false. And let's also export this state from here. All right, now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create and export an interface, and let's call this interface shared state. Okay, and in here for now, let's specify isLoading property of type Boolean. And let's set the type of this initial state as shared state. Now I'm going to register this state in app state because that state is going to be used application wide. So here I'm going to add a new property. I'll call it as shared, which is going to be of type shared state. Okay, and in here, okay, for that we will create another property called shared and we will map it to a reducer. So for that we also need to create a reducer. So in the shared folder, first of all, let's go ahead and let's create an action file. So here I'm going to call it as shared.actions.ts. In here, we are going to create and export an action. I'm going to call it as setIsLoading. And to create an action, we are going to use createAction function from NgRx Store. To this, first we need to specify a type. So here, since we are going to use this action on shared state, first I'll specify shared and then I'm going to call it as setIsLoading. Okay, and here it is also going to receive a props. And what props it is going to receive? It is going to receive an object where, let's say, we'll call it as value, which is going to be of type Boolean. And after this, we also need to invoke it. And to use this props, we also need to import it from NgRx Store. We already know this from our previous lectures. So to make it more readable, I'm going to move it to separate lines. All right, so here we have created an action. Now let's go ahead and let's create a reducer file. And I'm going to call it as shared.reducer.ts. Okay, now here we are going to create a reducer. For that again, let's say export const, and I'm going to call it as shared reducer. And to create this reducer, again, we are going to use createReducer function. To this, first, we need to pass the initial state. Now, which initial state we want to pass here? We want to pass the initial state of shared state. Basically, we want to pass this state object as the initial state. So let's use initial state here and let's import it from shared state. And now let's create a reducer using this on method. And to use it again, we need to import it from NgRx Store. And in here, first we will specify for which action this reducer function will be executed. This reducer function will be executed for setIsLoading. So let's go and let's import it. And then let's pass a second argument, a callback function. This callback function is going to receive the current state. So I'll simply call it as state, and it is going to receive the payload. So let's call it as action. Now from within this function, we are going to return a new state. In that new state, we are going to extract all the current property of the current state. So we are extracting all the properties from the current state with their current value. And then there, we are going to update isLoading state with the value which we have received with the props. So that we can get from action. So here we can say action dot, and it will have two properties: type, the type of action which has been dispatched. And when we were creating the prop, there we specified that in the payload, we are going to receive an object which will have a value property. So we are going to use this value property to set the value of isLoading. Let's save the changes here. Now let's go back to our app state, and there inside this AppReducer, we are going to specify the name for this state. I'm going to call it as shared, and to which reducer this state will be mapped to. In this case, it will be mapped to shared reducer. All right. So we created the state, we created action, and we created the reducer. And we have also mapped the shared state with this reducer. Now all we need to do is we need to use this shared state. Basically, we want to use this isLoading property of the shared state. But before that, let's go back to our application and let me open developer console. Let's go to Redux, and there let's see if the shared state is getting loaded or not. So you see the shared state is loaded, and there the current value of isLoading property of the shared state is false. Now let's go back to our application. Let me close these files for now, and let's go to app.component.ts file. Before that, we also need to create a selector. So again, in the shared folder, let's create a new file and let's call it as shared.selector.ts. And inside this, we are going to create a selector. So here, let's go and let's create a property. Let's call it get shared state. So not property, we are creating a variable here, a constant. And here we are going to create a feature selector. For that, we are going to use createFeatureSelector function. And to use it, we also need to import it. Now to this createFeatureSelector function, first we need to specify the name for the state. For that, again, I'm going to open the constant.ts file, and there I'm going to create and export another constant, and I'm going to call it as shared underscore state. And to this, let's pass a string value called shared. And now here we are going to pass that string value, so that constant, which is shared underscore state. With this, we have created a feature selector. Using this feature selector, we are going to create a selector. So here I'm going to again create and export a constant. Let's call it getIsLoading. Okay. And to create a selector, we use createSelector function. To this, first we need to pass the feature selector. In our case, it is getSharedState. This will be the first argument, and the second argument is going to be a callback function which is going to receive the current state, and from within this callback function we are going to return state dot is loading. Right. So for some reason intelligence is not showing. Let me save this file. Let's go back here and let's try to again access is loading state. There's something wrong here. If I go to shared state.ts, there we have this is loading property, but it is not showing here. All right, that's because here we have forgot to specify the type. So the type here is going to be shared state, and let's also import it. Okay, now it should show dot is loading. All right, so in this way we have also created the selector. Finally, we are going to use this selector to get the current value of is loading state. And since we want to use it in the app component, let me close these files. Okay, let's go to app.component.ts file. All right, now here we are going to create a property called showLoading. You can also call it as isLoading, and I'll use dollar here because it is going to receive an observable. So it is going to be of type observable, which is going to emit a Boolean value. Okay, so this is the type of showLoading. Also, I'm going to make this app component inherit. So for that, I'll use implements, and it is going to implement on init interface. And since this app component is implementing on init interface, we also need to specify ng on init lifecycle hook. And inside this, what we are going to do is we are going to select this get is loading state. And for that, we will have to inject an instance of store inside this app component. So let's also add a constructor here. Inside this constructor, Let's go and let's create a private property called store, which is going to be of type store. And here the type of the store is going to be app state. Okay, and to use this store, let's also import it. All right, now inside this ng on init, I'll say this dot show loading equals this dot store dot select. And what do we want to select? We want to select this getIsLoading selector. So let's pass that. And to use this getIsLoading, we also need to import it. And we know that this is going to return us an observable. So this show loading, it is going to store an observable. Now let's go ahead and let's use this property in the view template. So let's go to app.component.html, and there where we are showing the loader, there I'm going to use ngIf, and here I'm going to pass an expression. In there I'm going to use show loading dollar, and on that let's also use async pipe so that it will wait for the data to come. Okay, and then only it will be evaluated. With this, if I save the changes, currently this show loading is false. So if we go to our application, currently there is no loading indicator shown. Now when do we want to show the loading indicator? For now, whenever a user is going to make a login request, at that time we want to show the loading indicator. And once the response is received and the user is logged in, we want to hide the loading indicator. So for that, let's go to this auth folder, and inside that let's go to this auth state, and in there let's go to auth effects. So basically what I want is, before the login starts and we are sending a login request from within this effect, right? So before the login starts, I want to start showing the loading indicator, and once the login is successful, I want to hide the loading indicator. Also, if there is any error, at that time also, if we are showing a loading indicator, we might want to hide it. But currently we are not handling any errors here. So we will assume that the login request will be successful. So before sending the login request, we will show the loading indicator. And once the login is successful, we will hide the loading indicator. And for that, all we have to do is we have to dispatch setIsLoading action. And for that, first of all, we will need an instance of store inside this class. So let's go ahead and let's add a private store property, which is going to be of type store. And again, to use this store, we need to import it from NgRx Store. And now here, before we are sending the request, from here, we are going to dispatch setIsLoading action. And for that, we are going to make use of this store. And from here, we are going to dispatch an action. Which action? setIsLoading. And to use it, we need to import it from shared.action file. And with this, we also need to pass the data which we want to dispatch with this action. Here, it is expecting an object where we should have a value property. And since we want to show the loading indicator, the value should be true. All right. And once the login is successful, it will go inside this pipe method, this pipe operator. Inside that, we have this map operator. So inside this map operator, again, I'm going to dispatch this setIsLoading, but this time I'm going to pass an object where the value will be false, because here we want to hide the loading indicator. And with this, if we save the changes and if we go to our application, initially the value of isLoading is false. As you can see, isLoading is false. So that's why it is not showing the loading indicator. But now let's try to log in the user. So again, I'll pass test@gmail.com. And for that, the password is test1234. Now, this login request will finish quickly. So you might see the loading indicator for a very small amount of time. So just try to see that. If I click on this login button, you will see this loading indicator. And once the login is successful, the loading indicator is hidden and the user has been redirected to home component. So in this way, now we are displaying a loading indicator whenever a login request is sent to the server and response is received. Once the response is received, we are hiding the loading indicator. And here you can also see the email of the logged in user. Alright, so this is all I wanted to cover in this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.